Judge. It's great to be here. We've been traveling about. We've been over in Greenville. We've been traveling throughout this part of the country. And what's good for me is it's only about 30 minutes till I get home. I'm not far from home, just down the road. But a lot of people have been, talking about what's been going on, what's been on everybody's mind for the last year. And that's been basically the virus, how we deal with it, and how we get beyond this. And it hadn't been easy, for people. I just heard of a doctor this morning from Louisville that we were close to that died from the disease, so it can be very serious. But I think we have to figure out how to do it in a fashion still consistent with being a free country. And that means we won't all agree on what we want to do. We won't all agree about how we're going to treat it or how we're going to prevent it. But in a free society, we make those decisions individually. Someone doesn't tell us what to do. We make our decision. And on television, you'll see people lamenting, we don't have enough people vaccinated. But the truth of the matter is 90% of people over 65 have become vaccinated. They just chose to do it of their own free will without anybody forcing to. They just said their self-interest was there and they got vaccinated. Even over age 50, about 80% of people have been vaccinated now. So really, I would say that's how often do you get 80 or 90% of people to agree on anything? And they did this voluntarily. But some are saying now it's not enough. We have to, force vaccination on people. We have to force it on our children. And I'm against that. The thing is that if you count the 100 million of us who have already had the disease, how many people in here have had the virus? Quite a few. The interesting thing is if we measure antibodies for all of Morgantown, we'd find for every person who knows they had it, 2 more who don't know they had it. Particularly young people often get it and they don't know they had it. So the thing is the official statistics say that about 40 million Americans have gotten it. The estimates, even by the CDC, conservative estimates say 2 for every 1. So that's another 80 million. So really we're at about 120 million Americans. Almost a third of America, or a little over a third, has had the disease. Don't you think it ought to count for something? Immunity counts for something. If the vaccine works, why are we denying that the disease also confers immunity? Now, none of this is an argument for going out and getting the disease. I don't recommend getting it. It can be deadly, but if you've already had it, shouldn't we count that for something? One of our hospitals not too far from here, I heard, has over 800 people who work there. They took care of people who had COVID, and 800 of them got the disease. Shouldn't that count for something? Should we force them to get vaccinated even though they've already had the disease? And realize, I had to encounter this for a year. I had it over a year ago. And every day, liberal reporters who basically hate Kentucky and hate everything we stand for come up to me in the hallway and say, "You don't have immunity. What do you have to prove that you have immunity?" Well, a year and a half later, a huge study came out of Israel, and it said that if people have been vaccinated compared to people who have had the disease naturally, guess what? The people who have been vaccinated are 27 times more likely to get reinfected than someone who got it naturally. Once again, this isn't an argument against the vaccine. It's just an argument that we should acknowledge natural immunity. Natural immunity is what the vaccine's based on. We learned about natural immunity, and what a vaccine does is simulate natural immunity. Why does Dr. Fauci never say anything about it? Because basically he's used to what we call a noble lie. He lies to us for our own benefit, according to his logic. We're not smart enough to make decisions. You're not smart enough to know whether to get vaccinated or not, to wear a mask or not, or to buy the right kind of mask. He's going to tell you something, and it may be untrue, but he's telling you to do this because he thinks it's for your own benefit. I'll give you an example. At first he came out and said no masks work. He even privately was telling his friends through email the cloth mask doesn't work. That's probably still the truth. But then he changed his mind. At first he was saying no masks work because he didn't want you to buy the one mask that might work, which is the N95 mask. If you go to the hospital and you ask the doctors or nurses, what do you wear when you go in a room? They only wear the N95 mask when they go into a room with somebody with COVID. They wear that, they wear gloves, they wear a hazmat uniform, a whole thing. And then when they come out, they wash their hands and they throw it all away. If you can live your life like that, a mask might work. The problem with it is the masks that work has to be really, really tight and it hurts your face. And so doctors and nurses wear them for about 10 minutes at a time, then they take them off. But if you can wear that tightly fitting on your face all day long and not touch it, and then throw it away. And when you do touch it, the mask might work. But the problem is we just don't live our life that way. It's very hard for us to live that way. So we rely on things like the vaccine, but there's also a treatment. I've never heard Dr. Fauci on television talk anything about the treatment. There is a treatment that will save your life and that you need to know about, and that if your parents get sick, you need to know about. The best treatment out there is probably the IV monoclonal antibodies. This is made by Regeneron and Eli Lilly. It's an infusion, but here's the rub. You have to be within a certain window of time to get it. If you're not sick enough, they won't give it to you, and if you're too sick, they won't give it to you. So you have to be in this window of time. You have to be probably someone who is in a high-risk category, so over a certain age. They were using 55, but you almost have to have a little bit of bronchial symptoms. But in some older people, they'll just give it to them. In fact, if you're 80 years old and your spouse has it and you're taking care of them, they'll give you the monoclonal antibodies just for being with your spouse. 85% reduction in death and hospitalization. Every day I think we could be saving lives if we'd make it more available. Governor DeSantis in Florida is putting them out everywhere, these IV clinics where you can get it. But the interesting thing is, some in government, they won't explicitly tell you this, but some in government are downplaying this because they think, oh, if you think you can be treated, you won't bother to be vaccinated. But once again, it's not an argument against being vaccinated. I'm for that. I'm for your choice, but I'm in favor of persuading you to take it. But the thing is they're talking about, or not talking about the IV monoclonal antibodies because they have another agenda, basically. But we can survive this. We can get through this. All that being said, with 100 million of us, 120 million of us having had it naturally, I think we don't need to force kids to have this in school. The chance of a kid dying from this under age 25, not just kids, but under age 25, 1 in a million. It's actually less dangerous for children than the seasonal flu. If you say that on social media, they'll kick you off social media, but even the CDC says it's true. 1 in a million for children. Now, for my age and older, it's about 1,000 times more dangerous. Some of you will have known people who died from this. It's 1,000 times more dangerous. But we should acknowledge the truth and not say everybody's the same. So 90% of people over 65 have voluntarily gotten vaccinated. Do we need to have 90% of our 5-year-olds vaccinated? Should we not be able to say, well, my 10-year-old got it 2 weeks ago and I don't feel like vaccinating my kid who just got it? Even the CDC says you shouldn't do that. But have you heard any of the employer mandates say, oh, well, you can wait to take the vaccine? They're just not acknowledging the disease at all. And there may be, this isn't certain, but there may be extra side effects if you've already had the disease and being vaccinated, particularly quickly. Even the CDC says that. But not to acknowledge it at all is to not acknowledge the science. And there are lawsuits going on this. There's a professor at George Mason. He had COVID. He has a doctor's note. He has antibodies and doctor's note saying they don't think he needs to be vaccinated. They put him up for termination. And it was going to go to court, and then the university actually compromised on him. But I think you ought to be at least halfway reasonable for people who've already had it, for goodness sakes. But for kids, I don't understand why we're forcing them to wear a mask and why we'd force them to be vaccinated. It makes no sense at all. They have more chance of dying from being struck by lightning. So what we should do is, if we're going to make them wear masks, we should also make them carry a lightning rod, and the lightning rod should be put in the ground 6 feet away from where they are when they're at recess, so if the lightning comes down, it'll hit the rod instead of them. This is, the disease may recur. So far it looks like it's going to be with us and change. If it comes every year, are the kids that are now kids going to have to wear masks for the rest of their time as a child? So I think we need to be a little more realistic with this. But one way of doing it that's consistent with our values is to let people make their decisions. If you are very worried about it and your kid is sickly or you're sickly and you're worried about it, wear a mask. Now, I'm not making fun of anybody for wearing a mask, but it ought to be your choice. Vaccination ought to be your choice. People say, oh, I'm vaccinated, but he's endangering me because he's not. No, he isn't. If you're vaccinated, you've got about as much protection as you can. Be aware of it. You still can get sick, but be aware of it. It's your responsibility. You're not responsible for every other individual for what they choose to do with their medical care. The treatment and the response to this by government has caused a lot of other problems. The lockdown, the prevention of hotels being opened, of restaurants being open has been devastating. We've had thousands and thousands of bankruptcies, worse in states that had worse lockdowns. But if you look at the mandates and you say, well, we needed to take care of public health, that's what our governor would say. We had to take care of public health, so we had to shut down the restaurants. There's no evidence that those mandates changed the incidence of the disease. So in January of this year, when we had 300,000 people a day with the disease, we had more mandates than we never have. If anything, the more mandates, the more disease we got. Now, I'm not saying the mandates cause the disease, but if they were working, the more mandates you'd get, the less disease you would get. When the disease finally plummeted was when the vaccine came out. So for the first several months of the vaccine, there was evidence that we had a dramatic reduction in numbers. The reason it's not so good now is the new variant is escaping the vaccine. Once again, not an argument against the vaccine, it just is a fact of life. So we have to be prepared if we do get it, what kind of treatment. Number one, monoclonal antibodies. Realize there's a window, don't wait too long, talk to your doctor, and hopefully a significant number of people can survive this. But the other response has been to spend and borrow a huge amount of money. So last year we borrowed $3 trillion. And for the last 5 years we've been borrowing $1 trillion every year anyway. So then we added 2 or 3 trillion on top of that last year. Now we're talking about buying $5 trillion this year. We borrowed more money in a short space of time than we ever have in the history of our country. More than during World War II, which was the time when we had the biggest expenditure of money. That is not free. Nothing in life is free. If somebody calls you on the telephone and wants to give you $1,000, what's the first thing that goes through your mind? It's a scam. When your government offers you a $1,400 check, I'm not saying don't cash it. Anybody not cash it? Everybody will cash a check. Surprised people like free money. But in the end, it's not free. There are repercussions. And the repercussions are when we print up a whole bunch of money and give it to you, we dilute the value of your money. And so what happens is prices are higher, and it's insidious. It happens slowly and imperceptibly, and you're at the end of the year, you're like, wow, I thought I was $1,400 richer, but it seems like I'm about the same as I was or worse. Why? Because prices rise. Even normal inflation gradually steals your income. Over the last 10 years, before all the COVID spending, we had 1.7% inflation a year. And you're like, well, that sounds good. The Fed says under 2% is really good. But 1.7% times 10 is 17%. So a decade of 17% loss of purchasing power. If you were retired on a fixed income and your income didn't go up at all, you lost 17% of your income. There are many people either on Social Security or fixed income that didn't get a 17% increase. Even if you got a 17% increase, you're exactly the same. So you're lucky to break even. But this is what we get when it's something for nothing. The government offers you free, but really you want to pay for it by higher prices at the pump and at the grocery store and for the things you want. There is no free lunch. There is nothing in life that is really free. We instinctively know this. We know we don't get anything without working hard. You don't get anywhere without working hard. And yet that is the allure of something for nothing. So what's going on in Washington? So when I go back in a couple weeks, there's going to be a $3.5 trillion bill waiting there. It's going to be free child care, free this, free that. Right now we're paying people $32,000 a year in Kentucky not to work. So if you're a husband and wife and you each get $32,000, you're at $64,000. The child tax credit is refundable. If you have 2 kids and a husband and wife unemployed, $64,000 plus another $15,000 for the child tax credit. Now you're at about $80,000. Earned income tax credit, you're about $85,000. So if you work the system, you can get $85,000 a year for being unemployed. That means there's a lot of jobs that are going to go unfilled if you make less than that. Now some people are still working just because they have the pride of it, but why would you work if you make $30,000 a year? If you can get $32,000 for not working and then do a little cash on the side. That's what's going on. But as a consequence, you go to a restaurant and the sign will say, sorry, we're so slow today. We only had 2 people show up. But these are the things we have to think through. And in Washington, I call this syndrome the big heart, small brain syndrome. They want to help people, and they're maybe even sincere in wanting to help people. But the problem is by making unemployment too high, they've discouraged work. And the longer people are out of work, the less likely they are to go back to work. A couple years ago, we did this with unemployment. We had 26 weeks of unemployment. We extended it to 99 weeks, almost 2 years. But what we found was, without fail, if you go in, let's say your 99 weeks is coming up and you got to go back to work. You've been out of work 99 weeks and there's another person that shows up that's been out of work 5 weeks. Who do you think the employer hires? Every time, the one that's been out of work last time. Why? They start to wonder something about your work ethic if you haven't been working 99 weeks. You forget your skills, you lose your skills, but employers think that you don't have work ethic. And they're always, if they have a choice, going to hire somebody that's been out of work less time. And so what happens is you think you were helping people. The intention was to help people that are unemployed. You feel sorry, you want to help them. So you either make the wage too high or the period too long, and in the end, you've made them permanently unemployable, permanently unemployed. And this matters not only for an economy, it matters for something even more important, your self-esteem. We get our self-esteem from work. I don't care whether you clean the carpets or you own the building. You get your self-esteem from work. If you don't work, it's hard to get self-esteem in any other way. They can give you a prize, they can give you a trophy and say you ran fast even though you didn't, but you got to earn it somehow in life. And people have to realize, and I think most of us do, you don't have to be the owner of the Titans. You don't have to be the owner of a big business. You get your self-esteem through work. But if we discount that and we have a permanent class, not just a small number that can't work, which we understand, but we get a larger and larger class of people who don't work, we ultimately, it's the phenomenon of having too many people in the wagon and too few people pulling the wagon. That's a problem we end up facing. We have to remember what made our country great. What made our country great was that we acknowledged that our rights come from God, that our rights, the reason for government, that government was instituted among men to protect those rights, and that we're not supposed to have a government that coddled us from cradle to grave. It's a government that protects us from others. We can't be fooling around with ridiculous notions like defunding the police. You know, we have to believe that there is a government, but the government is there for a few basic purposes: to keep us safe, to keep people from harming each other. But we can't have a government that just gives everything to everyone because there isn't enough money for it. My wife and I wrote a book a couple years ago called The Case Against Socialism. And people are like, well, doesn't everybody know how terrible socialism is? Well, you would think. But the kids these days either aren't being taught it or don't get it. You know, who's Stalin? I don't think they remember. Who's Hitler? Who's Mao? Here's how bad it is. Mao, 45 million people were starved under Mao because of government policy. The head of Black Lives Matter, she just bought her $4 million home. Apparently, she's worried about the riffraff, so while she doesn't want a wall on the southern border, she's building a wall around her $4 million home. But she was doing an interview on the internet. A young woman comes up, and they're just giggling and laughing, and the young woman says, "Oh, your book, I loved your book. Your book reminds me so much of Mao's Little Red Book." Mao printed up billions of them. This little red book talking about his socialism, the plan that killed 45 million people. You had to carry them or you were beaten if you couldn't show you had your little red book when you walked around in China. Well, they're giggling over how great it is to be compared to Mao. And it's like, if you were giggling over your enthusiasm for Mao, you're either evil or ignorant of history. You know, you're one or the other. There really isn't a choice. But our generation of young people need to know that socialism's not benign. They're trying it in Venezuela right now. They've destroyed the currency. Venezuela has more oil underground than Saudi Arabia, but they're destroying the country, destroying the currency. In our book, we tell the story of a 16-year-old girl who's in a gang, and their territory they're guarding is 4 dumpsters outside of restaurants to get scraps of food. They're eating their pets in Venezuela. Socialism doesn't work. We've got to figure that out. And people say, oh, but what about greed in America? Well, guess what? Capitalism and self-interest in America has allowed the poorest among us to be richer than the middle class in almost every country around the world. You've been to Afghanistan. The average income in Afghanistan is about $800 a year. Very few people have cars. I mean, you want to, people, I forget who it was, somebody was watching this chaos and thinking about the Taliban taking over, and they were like, yeah, we're always talking about oppression in our country. Go see what they're going to get to live under in Afghanistan. The exit from there, we were talking about, it rivals incompetence. I mean, you almost think that you couldn't intentionally be more incompetent than that. How could we leave so many people stranded and leave the air base before we had left? You know, the 13 soldiers that died might have had a chance at Bagram Air Force Base. Were you at Bagram ever? The air base probably is protected by concrete, you know, and has chances to survive a bomb. You can see people coming for 10 miles away, and yet we're at a commercial Air Force base with just hundreds and hundreds of people everywhere, unable to tell who's friend and who's foe. But what a disaster. You would think still on the way out, if they took all of our stuff at Bagram, you'd blow it all up on the way out. We have the capability of doing it. We could have blown up all the planes and helicopters. But I don't think the lesson is that we should have stayed longer. I think the lesson is maybe that we stayed too long, that we shouldn't stay forever, that we're not very good at creating nations, that, you know, we build them, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars of highway, and then the Taliban would take them over and charge tolls on the highway we built. You know, some of the people we dealt with over there were good people, but some of them were drug dealers also. And some of the people actually chose the Taliban over the drug dealers. So the bottom line is it never really was much of a country. They didn't fight a day. They didn't fire one shot to defend their capital. Their president left on a helicopter. But it is insulting to see them with 300,000 small arms, dozens of our planes, dozens of our helicopters, thousands of Humvees and armored personnel carriers. It's just really disappointing and disgusting to see it. The bottom line is the Constitution has a rule for us. The Constitution says you go to war infrequently, when you have to, when you're attacked. When you go to war, you try to go united. Congress votes on it. We declare war. We were pretty united after 9/11. Just about everybody voted to go to Afghanistan after 9/11. But the proclamation was very specific. It says we'll go after those who attacked us and those who aided or harbored them. But then we took that proclamation from 9/11 and we're in Mali. We're in Somalia. We're in Eritrea. We're in 42 different countries, all based on something that says we're supposed to go after the people who attacked us on 9/11. You know, we had 4 soldiers die in Mali a couple years ago. It's like, Mali? Where's Mali? And who the heck voted to send these kids to Mali? But they were chasing a goat herder there. And I don't think that goat herder had plans to come attack us. They have a lot of internal civil war disputes throughout all of these different countries. And really, if we want to go there, fine. Well, let's vote as a people. And I'm a no vote. You can get rid of me if you don't like that. But I'm not for fighting in most of these places unless we're attacked. So we should have gone to Afghanistan. We should have done what we did. But I think we shouldn't have tried to stay forever and ever and ever. But in the end, a dismal sort of withdrawal. But I'd like to leave you with this. What we have is a great country. It's worth fighting for, and I hope you'll remember that. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take a few questions. Yes?
When do you think that infrastructure deal might pass?
You know, basically Nancy Pelosi has said it's 2 or none. She wants both bills, and so she's playing a gambit right now to try to make sure that the bigger package passes also. On the Democrat side in the Senate, Manchin and Sinema are saying they don't want the bigger package to be as big. I predict that one passes also, but maybe not quite as big. So I think Manchin and Sinema pare it down a little bit, and then it passes both sides. The infrastructure's passed the Senate. I think it will pass the House ultimately and becomes law. There's about $1.2 trillion in that, and a significant portion of that is infrastructure. The second bill is stuff they're calling infrastructure, but really has nothing to do with, free child care. You may want something free, but it's not infrastructure. What else do they have in there? Free community college, things like that. But it's not free. I mean, it's going to appear to be free. But I think the original one you're talking about is going to pass, I think probably by the end of September. Yes?
Senator, excuse me, we have several farmers in the room, and the estate tax exemption and that getting jockeyed with, and the loss of stepped-up basis is a big issue for all of our small farms and large farms and all in agriculture. If you'd comment on that.
I'm not for an estate tax at all. You pay taxes your whole career. There's no reason why they get you again just for dying. So I'm against an estate tax. On the stepped-up basis, this is like if your grandfather bought the farm for $100,000 and it's now worth $1 million, you inherit it. You shouldn't have to pay taxes on how it appreciated during his lifetime. If you sell it it should be between $1 million. You sell it for 1.2. It's that appreciation that you get. And that's the stepped-up basis. We should keep that. The Biden administration has proposed that we get rid of that and increase the estate tax and the capital gains tax and the corporate tax. They're going to increase a lot of taxes. Some of it's going to pass. Whether or not the stepped-up basis, the loss of the stepped-up basis is going to pass is an open question. It's mostly dependent on Manchin and Sinema. None of us on our side are going to vote for any of it. So I'm a no vote on any of that. So those two Democrats, they need to have every Democrat plus the vice president. That's the question. If you're associated with the Farm Bureau or any kind of group, I say write letters and try to get the Farm Bureau in West Virginia and in Arizona to send letters. But I'd also send letters from you. You don't have to send them to me. I'm already on your side. But send letters to Manchin. He needs 10,000 letters from farmers on the stepped-up basis. And really, the Farm Bureau nationally should have this as a goal. You should be sending thousands and thousands and thousands. Nobody reads them all, but somebody reads them and catalogs them. So I'll get a report every day. If I get 200 letters on one side of an issue, I know it. So I think that's the best thing I can tell you to try to avoid it, is send letters to Sinema, Manchin, and make sure you're talking to the Farm Bureau there, that everybody's writing them. But it's not just farms. There are a lot of small businesses that pass down in families. Manufacturing, construction, accounting. You can think of a lot of different family businesses where step-up basis would be devastating.
Thank you.
Yes?
How justified do you feel that the Freedom of Information Act or Freedom of Information papers came out by Dr. Fauci to gain function?
You know, I do feel like that I've done the right thing, but I think more importantly, I'll feel better if you were actually to leave government. And it's not just about feeling right. I think his judgment is incredibly bad. So, for example, you could say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, he thought the Chinese were trustworthy and we should fund their lab in Wuhan, which I would have disagreed with 5 or 10 years ago. But in retrospect, looking back, now that half the world or more, half the scientists even now acknowledge this probably came from the lab. He was asking committee just the other day, do you still trust the Chinese? He's like, yeah. It's like the bad sign, the coronavirus is over there. You have to go over there to study them. It's like, well, you shouldn't give money to people you don't trust who may be developing this for actually as biological weapons. And so the fact that he hasn't even learned from it. But it gets even worse than this. People have looked into his statements. In 2012, he said this, and this is pretty close to a direct quote. He said that if a scientist should become infected in a lab and it starts a pandemic, it would still be worth it. I'd like him to tell that to the 4 million people who died, that it was worth it. You know, if this came from a lab and we funded the lab, my goodness. But you'll notice they always run circles. So I pointed out these scientific papers where they've taken a virus, combined it with another virus, and increased its ability to be contagious to humans. And he'll say, and he'll respond, but that virus is too distant from COVID. It's not COVID. And it's like, I'm not alleging it's COVID. I'm just saying they were using the techniques where they could have created it. And if they had one that was COVID-19, you think they're going to admit it? This was stuff that was already published before the pandemic started. If they were experimenting with the actual COVID-19 or something close to it, there's no way any of those records exist anymore. They're not going to admit it. But the fact that they were doing this type of research and that we were helping them do the research and teaching them how to recombine these viruses. But also, this isn't just China bashing. I don't think we should do this research in our country. We do it in North Carolina and Georgia. Same kind of very, very dangerous research. And I don't think we should be. And I'm a pro-science person. Look, I come from a scientific background. But we should not be making viruses that don't exist in nature and then experimenting with them in the lab. It's a huge mistake. Maybe one or two more?
Where are we at on WOTUS?
On what?
WOTUS?
WOTUS, the waters of the U.S. We thought it was dead. We tried to kill it under Trump, and it's back. Basically, tell them I'm not here. Or maybe that's my time's up, right? Waters of the U.S. was basically this crazy idea that if we can somehow imagine that water on your farm is connected to a river, connected to a lake or the ocean, somehow that you are federal property now and the federal government can regulate you. Now, this isn't about dumping benzene in your water. You're not allowed to do that, whether it's a local rule or federal rule. But it's about crazy regulatory overreach. There were actually people regulating and saying that if a geese landed on a pond, on a cattle pond on your farm, that geese was once on the Great Lakes, so now you're part of the Great Lakes, and we're going to regulate you the same as the Great Lakes. That's the kind of craziness. So it started under President Obama. President Trump reversed it, but all by executive order. So now Biden's going to reverse it. We're going to get it back. Will we immediately see the effects of it? Depends on how aggressively they try to enforce it. But this is an overall sort of philosophical fight. It's not just about this. It's about whether or not you'd rather be controlled, by people in Butler County, by a judge executive that you can call on the phone, or do you want to be controlled by distant bureaucrats who don't know anything about farming, don't care anything about you or your family. And that's why it's always better to be closer, because, like I say, nobody wants dirty water. But if you live here, don't you think you and all your neighbors care about your water? You care about your water, so you're not going to do things, and if you are, you'll get in trouble. But we care about it as much or more than somebody who doesn't live here. And so I don't understand why we ever gave up all this control to the federal government. The thing about the federal government, too, is if you get people in charge of regulating, they say you have to have a certain many parts per billion in your water of something. Well, the thing is that they're not seeing the other side of how many people work for you, how much income you bring into the community, and what you do for the community. There's a balance. And there's never sort of a zero admission. Is there going to be a time, let's say we don't like fertilizer in the stream. Maybe there's too much. Maybe I don't know what the exact number is, but we figure that out. But if we don't have fertilizer, we also don't have food. So there's always this trade-off back and forth, but reasonable people would get together, your magistrates, that's where the rules ought to be. At the worst, at the state level, but instead we've farmed it out, so to speak, to the federal level, but they have no consideration for jobs. See, it should be a balancing act between jobs and the environment, and there'd be certain things we just wouldn't let. Dumping benzene in a stream, chemicals like that, we wouldn't do. But a lot of the other things, there really has to be a give and take and a debate over what is too much and what is too little and what the rules should be. And I think we'd figured out a lot better here. It's sort of like, like the mussels. We've protected all these mussels by endangered species. Most of them are not really endangered. It's like COVID. They're not really obeying the science. The pocketbook mussel, 17 years ago, they put on the list. They looked in 7 places and said, oh, we can't find it in a couple of these places. Since then, they've looked in 20 other places. Everywhere they look, they find the damn thing. So there are mussels everywhere, and it really shouldn't be on the endangered list. So I have a bill on waters of the U.S. to fix that, to define it is that a navigable stream is something that you can float something down. So a ditch on your property, or when it rains and there's water in a ditch, is not a navigable stream. Neither is a cattle pond. All of these things should not allow them to regulate your property. There's 300 different plants that they can determine that are a wetland. Turning over leaves that are black on the bottom is a possible determinant that your land is a wetland by finding leaves that are black on the bottom. That's crazy. With the mussels, I have a bill to say the Endangered Species Act should be statewide, and it should be under the purview of the governor and the state legislature. We'd have a better chance of having being able to shoot some black vultures if we have to.
One more.
Yes.
What about the banks having to report to the IRS your outflow and inflow of your accounts if it's over $600, I think it was?
Yeah, that's an invasion of privacy we shouldn't let stand. It's based on a false notion that most of us are not paying our taxes. I think the notion is the opposite. Most of us don't have much choice. I mean, if you're employed by somebody, what are the chances that you're not paying your taxes? Very little. Almost all of it's taken out of your check to begin with. But looking at everybody's account is an amazing and incredible intrusion into your privacy. And most of the time it doesn't work. They want to spend $10 billion to hire new IRS agents and to look in everybody's account. And they claim they'll get $50 billion more. But do we want to live in a world where they squeeze you to squeeze another penny out? Or would you rather live in a world where the taxes are reasonable and most people comply because they're reasonable? There are some arguments that when taxes are more reasonable, less complex, more people actually do comply. And so I think the vast majority of people comply. I'll bet you 90% of it, I get a check like anybody else. All my taxes are taken out of the check. There's very little I can do to alter my tax bill. Now, if you're in business, it's a little easier to, but most people end up paying taxes. So when they estimate they'll get $50 billion, they're going to spend $10 billion and they're going to they won't bring in what they estimate. Even the CBO said they won't. Let's hope we can defeat that. That's going to be part of this package. whether we defeat it or not, will happen in the next couple weeks. Yes?
With all these cities and states trying to pass vaccine mandates, what's the recourse for somebody that has a reaction to the vaccine? There's not any path now for a person to use.
It's going to be difficult. The Supreme Court hasn't been very good on the issue. The last ruling was in 1905, and in 1905 they ruled that a guy that had already had the smallpox vaccine that didn't want to get it again because he had a bad reaction, they told him, we don't care, and you got to get it anyway. Now his was a fine. And here's the interesting thing, and I read this today. One of the cases comes from the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It's an old decision. They actually said that you can't be forced to get it. You can be fined. They may be able to take away your access to something, and that's what I think they'll try to do. But they actually can't force you. But there were actually times, particularly poor minorities, were forcibly vaccinated, were held down and vaccinated. But for the most part, the court has not ruled on forcible vaccination. They've approved fines. And even those have said there can be reasonable arguments. I think the strongest argument, I'm for you make your decisions. I'm for complete freedom on it. I'm not against the vaccine, but I'm for complete freedom on it. But I think even stronger would be the argument, I already had it. So I think the cases that we ought to press forward with to see if we can get some limitations on their power are, I've got antibodies, tell me why I have to get it. Because there's now studies, like I say, showing that antibodies may be, from natural infection, may be as good or better than the vaccine. In fact, I think the people with the natural infection are not the vaccine won't escape the natural infection as much as it's escaping the vaccine. And the one reason is when you're infected, you get immunity to a broad range of different proteins on the surface. When you're vaccinated to one specific protein. So if it escapes that protein, then you just don't have as much defense. Once again, not an argument against vaccines, but an argument that we should acknowledge it. But it's really unfair. These people who work in the hospital that have already been infected, they risked their life to take care of people with COVID. They got COVID, they survived it, and now we're going to tell them, we don't care that you already have immunity, just take the vaccine.
Is that going to become a piece of federal legislation on either side?
I'm not sure how much. I think a lot of it, we're getting already. It's coming from employers. And it's going to happen. It's already happening. I don't know that it requires federal legislation. I don't know if the Supreme Court would uphold it as some sort of broad mandate for everybody. But they get us every which way. I mean, it's like, travel, school. We already force kids to take like 40 some odd vaccines. And once again, I'm not against the vaccines, but when I gave my kids all the vaccines, but when they were little, it's like they're newborns in the hospital and they want to give them hepatitis B. And it's like, well, you can get that through sex or IV drugs. I think my newborn's safe for a while, And it's like, I don't know. The thing is, it shouldn't be my choice whether I do it or when I do it. We finally did it because we're like everybody else. You got to go to school. But what are they going to stop? I mean, what if there's 200 vaccines? That my kid going to get all 200 vaccines? Is there any problem between the vaccines? Is there any problem if my child's already had the disease getting the vaccine? So we should be studying these things. Are there more complications if you've already had the disease and then you get the vaccine? Even the CDC recommends don't get the vaccine for 3 months. I don't know. But I do worry about all this, but the only way it would ever stop is if a number of people resist. There are people resisting some of these mandates, but the courts are ruling they have the right to fire you. The other thing is hospitals have required for a long time certain vaccines. Like hepatitis B, I am vaccinated for it because they felt like a surgeon could transmit it to somebody. So I've been vaccinated for that. In the military, you're vaccinated for anthrax, hepatitis B, you name it. You've got to probably had a bunch of them. So I don't think anybody's going to win those cases in the military. Although the one argument you could have is I've already had it. That case you might win based on the science. I don't think you'll win the argument of, I should have the freedom not to. So people who are lucky to work for themselves won't have to submit, but those who work for others, I think will be more and more. Not based on science, based on fear. And so we already have. There are people that are bitterly, this is how sad a world we live in. The left glorified when a radio broadcaster down in Nashville died from COVID because he didn't get vaccinated. They glorified in that and said basically he deserved it. There are people on the left who wouldn't even treat people. They just say, oh, you chose not to be vaccinated. You're not a human. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And the thing is people who've gotten vaccinated are going to get sick and die too. They are. But the thing is I don't wish a mill will. I mean, we should try to treat everybody. But it's a sad world when people are rejoicing in someone's death.
Is anybody going to be held accountable for the 13 that we lost? I mean, shouldn't really a committee be put together? It's sorry.
The problem with the committees is they control all the committees. They control all the committees in the Senate and the House, so they won't let us have hearings. Now, I will have Blinken in my hearing. The Secretary of State will be in my hearing next week, and I will ask him questions about this. That's probably as good as we're going to get, but they're pros at not answering the question. Realistically, if something this bad happened and I were in charge, I would fire whoever was in charge of the withdrawal. Either that's Milley or Austin. It's probably more likely Milley. But Milley seems to be interested in a lot of things other than military strategy right now. I think he's a bit gone adrift in worrying about other things other than the military. But yeah, I think Milley ought to go for that. I mean, really, people do die in war, but it's really sad that 13 soldiers died on the last day of the war, and with poor planning, They wouldn't have died probably at Bagram had they been defending Bagram. Maybe one more.
Do you know, or can you speak to the Americans that are still in Afghanistan? I've heard that the Taliban is blocking flights out at this time.
There's two sides that are saying different things. Some are saying that they're blocking them. Our State Department is saying that we don't know who hauls on the planes. There are some Americans, but there are also many Afghans, and they want to see everybody's visa. So I can kind of see both sides of that. There's 4 or 5 planes, and I kind of want to know which Afghans are coming here too. That we need to make sure that we aren't inviting the Taliban on some of those planes to come live in America. But I don't know. I think it's going to be resolved, is my guess. The main thing is I don't want any of our money going to the Taliban. And so what I fear will happen, because we have a bunch of money, we were giving $50 billion a year to the Afghan government. It stopped, but what I fear is they're going to turn that back on. And look, I'm willing to see we're gone now whether the Taliban will behave. I don't necessarily think they will, but I'm not for giving them money to behave, and I'm not for really giving them any money, frankly. And I would have blown up all that equipment on the way out. There's no way I would have left anything standing. But, all right, thanks, everybody.
Agencies. Please contact our Bowling Green office or visit our website.